Hello. In this tutorial we're going to expand our game to manage the different states that the game can be in. So right now when we run our game, all the enemies start coming at us, but what if we wanted to have a main menu, or we wanted to trap when the player was killed, or we wanted to allow the game to be paused? In order to do that, I'd like to maintain a different state for the game. So it's either in the menu state, or it's in the playing state, or it's in the paused state, or it's in the dead state, meaning the player has died and maybe we want to allow them to replay, or maybe they've paused the game and we want to stop the enemies from moving and so forth. So in order to do that, we're going to introduce this concept of an enumeration. And an enumeration gives us the ability to use different symbols or words instead of using integers. So it could be that we could say that the current state is equal to 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, but that wouldn't be very usable in our code. Rather, what I'd like to do is I'd like to say that the current state is either in the menu state, or the playing state, or the pause state, or the dead state. And so I can do this using an enumeration. So inside of our class, appmain, I'm going to create what's called a private enum, and so enum is the keyword that we'll use for enumeration. And then I'm going to give this enumeration a type or a symbol, and I'm going to call this game state. And then inside of the curly brackets, I'm going to create all of the symbols for the possible states that the game could be in. So we start off in the menu state, and then maybe we move into the playing state, and I could pause the game. So the game could be in the paused state, or I could be in the dead state. So here we have the 4 different states that the game could be in: menu, playing, paused, and dead. Now later on I need to create a variable of this type, so I'm going to scroll down here, and the new variable that I'm going to create is going to be a private static, and it's going to be a game state, which is what we just created, right? So that's that enumeration we just created, and I'm going to call it the current state. Now current state is a variable that can contain the value menu, playing, paused, or dead. Now ultimately all of these map to integers, so anything that you could do with just using a variable of type int, you could do with any enumeration. But as you'll see in a moment, we're going to be able to make the code a little bit more readable and track which state we're in a little more cleanly in the code by using this enumeration. And now down here at my initialize, I want to make sure that my game begins in the proper state. So I'm going to say that the current state is equal to game state dot, and now you can see that we have our 4 choices here. We've got dead, menu, paused, and playing. It's going to alphabetize these here, and it doesn't really matter the order, but we're going to start the main game in the menu state. So the current state is going to be game state.menu. Now I'm going to use this because in my update method, all of the code that we have here presumes that the game is actually playing. And rather, what I'd like to do is in the update and in the render, I want to see what game state I'm in, and then process user input or process the rendering differently depending upon what state we're in. I'm going to use a new construct called switch that's going to allow me to do a comparison of a particular variable and see, does this variable match these different values. So I'm going to switch on current state, and I have different cases. I have game state.menu, and I'll handle that one. I've got game state.dead, and I'll handle that one. I've got a case for game state.paused, and I'll handle that one. And I have game state.playing, and I'll handle that one. So what we're going to do in each of these different cases is do some different code depending upon which state the current state is in. So if current state matches menu, it's going to do whatever code I put here. If current state is dead, then it's going to do whatever I do, all the code that I put here. If the current state is equal to paused, it's going to do whatever I tell it to do here. So I'm going to break this out into separate functions and then perform the logic of processing the user's input and doing whatever update logic I want to have happen in these separate functions. So you could put whatever code you wanted to here. I'm just going to call a new function that I'll write, update menu, and I'm going to insert this keyword break. Now we've talked about break before. Break was a way of stopping a loop and leaving a for loop, for example, as we saw in a previous tutorial. And for each one of our cases in our switch statement, the break is going to allow us to say stop looking at further cases and stop running any code there and break out of this switch statement, meaning I only want to run one of these cases. So as soon as I found one that matches, leave the switch statement and come down here. Okay, so I'm going to run the update method and then stop doing any of the switch statement. If the current state is equal to menu, I'm going to call update dead. If the current state is equal to dead, and don't forget your break statement there. If the game state is in paused, I'm going to run a method that I'll write called update paused, and then break out. And if the game state is in playing, I'm going to run a function that I'll call update playing, and then I'll break out of there. Okay, so there is our logic for the switch statement. It takes in a variable inside the parameter here, and then it's going to find a match based on the state of this variable. And if current state equals menu, it's going to do whatever code is here. If current state is equal to dead, it's going to do whatever the code is here. And I can have multiple statements here. In this case, I just have one, but I could put multiple commands here. And as soon as it sees the break statement, it's going to leave that switch statement and move on. And that's the logic that I'd like to have in my update. So now we're expanding our game to enable us to be in different states, the menu, the dead, the paused, or the playing. And I'm going to run different update methods depending upon what state I'm in. So it's going to track where I am and what state I'm in, and then it's going to run different code based upon that. Well, since we already have this code lying out here, let's do the update playing first. So let's create a public static void update playing. And the code that we already have is going to be good for us here. Right? We're going to still get the gamepad data and do all of this logic that we had with respect to updating. We're still going to do, we're just going to do it now if I'm in the update, if I'm in the playing state. Okay? I also want to create a public static void update function for each one of these others. Right? So we created a update menu call here. If I'm in the update, if I'm in the menu state, then I need to make sure that I actually run this update menu function and handle that processing. And I'm going to do the same for paused and for dead. So update paused and update dead. Okay, so now if I'm in the menu state, I'm going to run this. If I'm in the dead state, I'm going to run this. If I'm in the paused state, I'm going to run this. And if I'm in the playing state, I'm going to do that logic that we already had. And now I just need to implement the logic that goes into that. Now I can switch states by simply changing my current state variable. So let's go ahead and implement these. Let's go ahead, and I do want to examine the buttons that are being pressed for each one of these. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and say gamepad data equals gamepad.getData of 0 for both the update menu and the update paused, as well as the update dead. And then I want to see, for example, if the gamepad data dot buttons, and like the logic we've done before to test to see if a button is being pressed, gamepad buttons dot, we're in the update dead, so let's say if you press the select button, then I want to start a new game. Right? So if you're pressing the select button and I'm in the dead state, then I want to set the current state to be menu. So for example, if you've died in the game and we're going to display a different screen, and then you're going to press the select button on the Vita, and then I'm going to switch into the main menu state. Okay, I could do something very similar in the update paused. Right, let's say you've paused the game, and then I could look to see if you're pressing the triangle button, and maybe that is what we're going to look for to start playing the game again. So I'm going to run my update pause, right? And if you press the triangle button, I want to resume the game. So I'm going to set my current state to be equal to playing and get back into the game. And if I'm in the menu state and you press a button, then I'd like to process that. So let's say if you're in the menu state and you press the start button, we're going to start a new game up. Now, since I'm allowing you to restart the game and replay it, I'm going to have to put a little bit of logic in here to say I want to create a new game, and then I want to set the current state to be GameState.playing. Now the logic for generating a new game is going to be very similar to what we've done up here in Initialize, where we create new enemies and we reset our enemies list and our missiles collection and so forth. But for right now, we can just imagine that we've got a function here called new game, and as soon as you press the start button, if you're in the main menu state, then I want to kick off a new game and then tell you that I'm in this game state playing. So let's go ahead and define what a new game is now. So we can do that here underneath initialize. And what we're going to do is declare a new public static void new game function. And like I said, the logic up here in the update function is going to really be cut and paste down here. So we're going to start with the HUD, and we're going to cut that out. And we're going to put that down here in the new game because I need to establish the heads-up display and set that going. All of the ship and enemy I'm going to copy down. So this idea of the ship is going to get copied down. I'm going to pull that here and place it into my new game. The next thing is the enemies collection I need to bring down. And also this logic of creating the new enemies, I'm going to cut that out of initialize and put it into new game, because every time I start a new game I need to make sure that there are no enemies on the screen and that we just start with these enemies that we wanted to. The enemy time counter, or the time it's going to take before you're allowed to create a new enemy, is going to be copied down as well, because I want to make sure that the enemies are going to start to spawn at the appropriate time. The missiles collection needs to be empty, so I'm going to bring that down. I need to reset it so that there aren't any missiles on the screen when I start a new game. And then how long it takes before you can shoot a new missile, I'm going to bring this down because I want to make sure that it's fair and you can begin to fire missiles almost immediately there. And then I shouldn't have any explosions, right? The explosions collection should be this emptied out new list, and that's going to be important to put that into my new game function as well. Okay, so now I've got all of this setting up of a new game inside of this function new game, and I've really stripped out quite a bit from the initialize. So I've still got creating my audio and playing that background and setting the current state to be to the main menu. Now all I need to do to make sure that when I initialize I create all of these variables is just to invoke the new game function here in initialize. So all of that code that I pulled out from here, I just need to run that by invoking the new game, and everything will run as we'd expect it to, just as we had before. But I only need to load these sounds, the background song and the missile shot and the explosion once. I don't need to do that every time you play a new game. Right, so we'll still do those here, and I only need to create the new graphics context and the new background and foreground once, because I'll be able to use those. Those stay the same no matter what time or how many times I've played my game. And then the clock I only need to do once as well. Now, just like we did with the update function, where we're handling the different states, we're going to need to do that same thing in our render function. So I'm going to come down here under render, which is pretty low down. I've got this render function that assumes that we're actually playing the game, because it's going to render the enemies and the missiles and the background and foreground and so forth. But I don't want to be doing that. I only want to render these things if in fact we're in the player state. So rather what I'd like to do is use my switch statement again and switch on the current state, and then like I did in the update, I'd like to look at the different cases. Let's say we're playing, then perhaps I want to call the render playing, and remember we need our break statement there. In the case of GameState.dead, I'll render dead, and we haven't written these functions yet, but we will in a moment. In the case of GameState is in menu, I'll run a render menu function, and in the case where GameState is equal to paused, I'll render paused. Okay, and don't forget your break statement there. So now we've got these 4 case statements. Depending upon which state the current state is in, I'm going to run these different render functions. So here we've got the code for the render playing already written. So let's just write that. Public static void render playing. And then now all of that code that we did for the playing state is still going to be there, and that's exactly what we want to have happen, right? But we still need to write the render dead, render menu, and render paused. All right, so let's take this and define this function for render dead. And we'll need to do it for render menu and render paused. So we'll just do a bit of cutting and pasting. Render dead, we've got render menu now, and we'll need render paused. Okay, so if you're playing the game, then we're still going to render the background and the ship and the enemies and the missiles and so forth, just like we've done heretofore. But if you're in the dead or the menu or the pause state, I need to do the work there and actually type up the code to handle these different states. And we're still going to set our clear color and clear off the graphics. So that's going to be the same for each one of these. And we also need to make sure that we swap the buffers so that the back buffer that we're drawing to and the fore buffer or the display buffer that you're actually seeing is going to show up. So we still need this template code here. But just to prove that this works, for example, if we wanted to say render menu, we could take and set the background color to be slightly different, right? And we could make a very simple test and say, if you're in the menu state, then let's paint a red background. And if we ran this right now, before I do that though, what I'd like to do is comment out the audio, because I think that might be interfering with me talking. So I'm just going to comment out this background music player, and let's run it now. Right. And now you can see that we are in the main menu state because it is painting the background red. Okay. And if I press the start button, then now we're in the playing mode. And we can still shoot missiles, and all of that logic still works like we had before. So when we started the game, it started by rendering the background red, and that's because we were in the menu state, right? So our render function is run, and then the current state is examined, and it turns out that we're in the menu state, so it's going to run render menu. It comes down here into render menu, and it sets the clear color to be red, and then clears the display and swaps the buffers. So that's why the background was red. And then when I pressed the start button, right, if we go up here into the update menu function, if we are in the menu state, then I'm going to run the update menu function, and the update menu function is looking at the buttons being pressed, and if you pressed start, then I'm going to create a new game and then set the current state to be playing. So thereafter, when I'm drawing, I'm going to be drawing everything and updating everything just as if we were in that playing state like we had before. So this shows you how you can actually switch between game states like main menu and paused, and whether the player is dead or not there, and it's going to allow you to switch different states up. But clearly we don't just want a red background to be displayed here. We'd like to do a bit more work. So in the render menu, let's change this back here, this set clear color, back to black. And then I'm going to clear out my graphics buffer. Let's do background.render. And we'll go ahead and do the foreground render as well. So we're going to get our nice star field and our nebula being displayed. But what I'd like to do is then display a message to the user to say that they're in the main menu and they should press start to play. Now in order to do this, I could either modify my HUD so that we can display a menu on the heads up display, or what I'm actually going to do is create a menu display class, and it's going to allow me to display a message to the user. And I'm going to create an instance of this, and I'm going to switch between whether you're in the HUD mode or in the menu display mode, and then display one of them. What I'd like to do is tell this menu to say that you're in the main menu and then render it out. So it's going to display some text for us. Now in order to do that, I need to create a new class, and I'm going to call that the menu display class. So let's do that now. The easiest way for me to do that is actually to come to the HUD, and I'm going to copy the HUD. So I'm going to right click on HUD and select copy, and then under my project I'm going to paste, so I get a copy of HUD, and let me rename that by pressing F2, right, and I'll call this menu display. Okay, so here I'll close this down a bit, and you can see that I've got this menu display class. Let me rename this menu display, and then I'll change the constructor to be menu display. And we're not going to need as much in this class, so I'm going to go ahead and delete all but one of my labels and the graphics context, but I don't need the elapsed time for the frame and so forth, so I can just go ahead and delete that. The label I'm actually going to call announcement, and so I'll change this about. I still need to set my graphics context up and establish my scene, okay, but I don't have this FPS and I don't have this enemies or this missiles information, so I can go ahead and delete that. And I don't have the elapsed time or the frame count, so I can go ahead and delete those as well. Okay, I don't need update position, and so I'll go ahead and, well, let's leave that for now. I don't need the update FPS or the update enemy count, so, or update missile count, so I'll delete those out of here. But I'm going to change this update position, right, and get rid of it, and I'm going to replace it with an accessor so that I can change the announcement that's displayed. Since the label is called announcement, I'm going to copy that down here because we don't have this position anymore. Right. And I'm going to say that the announcement X and the announcement Y, I'm going to put this on the screen where I want it and set its width and its height and its text. And then I'm going to add into the scene, I'm going to add this announcement. Right? So I want to position this actually in the 0 on the X. And as far as the Y goes, I want to adjust this to where it's in the dead center of the screen. So the way I can do that is to take the height of the screen, right? So I have graphics.screen.rectangle.height and divide that by 2. But from that, I'm going to divide, or I'm going to subtract from that half of the height of this text itself. So I have this announcement, and I have this notion of a text height, and I can divide that by 2. So announcement is my label, and I'm going to ask the height of that text. Let me put the T on that, and I'm going to divide that by 2. So that means that in the vertical, this text is going to be perfectly centered. The width of this is actually going to be the graphics.screen rectangle width. So the label's width is going to be the size of this, and I'd like to center my announcement, so I'm going to set the horizontal alignment to be equal to horizontal alignment dot center. So this is going to make sure that the text appears horizontally aligned. Now the text itself, we could put anything here because we're going to immediately update it. So let's just say TBA or something like this. And now we have this new class menu display that I'll be able to post this announcement and it will display itself. The last thing I need to do is to create a public string, and this is going to give me an accessor and a modifier for my announcement. And I'll use capital A announcement here. So the label, you'll notice, has a lowercase a, but the capital A announcement is going to be what I'm making publicly available. So this string is going to be public. And if you ask me what the announcement is for this class, I'm going to return to you the announcement, lowercase a, text. So what's the text of this label that you've got here? And if you tell me to modify this announcement, I'm going to set the announcement text, or the text of the label, to be equal to whatever value you're taking in here. So now I've got a public accessor and modifier with a capital A announcement, and if you ask me what the value is, I'll tell you what the text of the label, and if you want to modify this, then I'll set the text of that label to be whatever value comes in. Okay, so now that we've actually got our menu display class defined, let's go back into our app main and let's make use of it. So what I'd like to do is up here at the top of my class, I want to create a new instance of this. So I'm going to create a menu display here. It's going to be a private static menu display, and I'll call it lowercase m menu display. And then in my initialize, I'll just create a new one of these. So I'll say menu display is equal to a new menu display. I only need to do this once inside of the initialize, just like I have the background and the foreground. I don't need to do that in new game. And what I'll do is I'll just update whatever text is displayed on this announcement as I go. And now we're finally at a point where we can come down here under our render menu, which was what we were doing to set all of this up. And I can say that the menu display's announcement should be equal to main menu. And I can say press start to play. And then I'll render the menu display. Right, so now when you're in the menu state, it's going to render the background and the foreground, and then it's going to display this string, main menu, press start to play, because I'm setting the announcement string to the main menu, and then I'm rendering it here. So now if we run the game, I need to fix this error here first. Notice that the constructor is expecting that graphics context, so I'm going to pass it graphics as a parameter here. And now if we run this, we'll see one more error. I've got a cut and paste in my menu display. Remember, the menu display we copied from the HUD, and so we don't need that frame counter in here. So I'll just delete that out of the render. That was my cut and paste error. Okay, now if we run this, we'll see that we are in the main menu, and now we've got our nice announcement, which is horizontally aligned and it's centered here in the middle of the screen. And if I press start, then now we've got our game that's running and we're in the running state. So now we have the ability to run in the main menu state, and it's displaying everything properly and also processing the user's input well. And we've also got the playing state running well. So let's go ahead back into our app main. And if you look at the code, we're going to need to modify our rendering for our dead and also our paused states. So let's handle if you're in the paused state. So what I can do is I can set the menu's announcement to be equal to paused, press triangle to resume, and if you go back to our update, then you'll see that the update for the paused state, if we go here, if I press the triangle button, right, so here's our update paused, and if you press the triangle button, then it's going to go back into the playing state. So it would make sense for us when we render the paused state to tell the player that if they want to resume the game, they need to press the triangle key. So notice that in the render paused, I'm going to change my display announcement, and then I'm going to render that menu display. So that'll handle the rendering of the paused state, but we can't actually pause the game yet. In order to do that for the update playing, right here, if I am actually in the playing state, I need to listen in and see if you pressed the pause key. And I'm going to let the user pause the game if the gamepad buttons is equal to gamepad buttons dot circle. So, whoops. So if you're pressing the circle key, then I'm going to pause the game. And I can easily pause the game by setting the current state to be equal to GameState.paused. So now as you're playing the game, if you press the circle button, then it's going to go into this current state as paused, and then the game will render the paused menu and so forth, and then it won't be actually playing the game. Now, in order for me to actually show that menu display, I need to switch between HUD mode and the menu display mode. So I'm going to set the menu display to be a new menu display here and pass it graphics. Whenever you go into the paused state, I need to make sure that my menu display is active. Now, if I don't do this, then the current scene manager is going to be displaying the HUD while the game is paused, and that's certainly not what we want to have happen. We want to make sure that that message of showing that the game is paused is what's being rendered to the screen. And likewise, after I've handled the coming out of the paused state, I need to make sure that the HUD is what's active. So in this update paused, I need to modify this to where I'm not just switching back to the playing state, but I'm also going to set the HUD to be active. The easiest way to do that is to say that the HUD is equal to a new HUD and pass it that graphics context. And that's going to assure that the scene manager is pointing to that HUD rather than to that display menu. So let's run this now and see what we get. And we're here in the main menu state, and if I press start, then I'll begin to play the game. And if I press the circle, then the game goes into the paused state, and you can see that we are showing the pause, press triangle to resume. And I can press all kinds of buttons right now, nothing happens, but as soon as I press the triangle button, we go back, and you'll notice that the ships are exactly where we left it. So the game, in fact, does pause rather well and works properly. Now the only thing that we don't have working yet is the handling of the dead state. And if you look at the update dead, we are allowing the user to press the select button to go back to the main menu, but down here under the render, right, we're not actually doing anything with the render dead. It's just clearing the screen and you'd see a black screen. We're not doing anything with the menu. We need to actually handle the collision between a player and an enemy ship, and if we get that, we're going to switch into the dead state, and that's what we'll do in the next tutorial. So as a review, what we've done in this is we've added this enumeration for the different states that we can be in menu, playing, paused, and dead. We then updated our update function to have a switch statement that's going to look at the current state and handle it differently depending upon whether we're in the menu, the dead, the paused, or the playing state. We did the same thing with our render. So down here in the render function, it's going to look to see what state we're in and then run a different function depending upon what state we're in. We created a menu display class that's going to allow us to show this label and then update the text. And then we just switched which state we're in by adjusting this current state function. So if you look here in our update, right, with all the different states, update menu, update paused, update dead, and update playing, we're able to very easily update which state was current and adjust whether we should be in the paused or the main or the playing state just by adjusting this variable. And like I said, in the next tutorial, we will process the collision between the main player and all the enemy ships. And then if we do have a collision, we'll go into that dead state and finish that up. And that'll do it for this tutorial.